Settle yourself comfortably now, finding that perfect position where your body can truly rest. Let your breathing slow and deepen, each exhale releasing the tensions of the day. Tonight, we embark on a journey through time, traveling back more than 2,700 years to witness the birth of one of history's most magnificent civilizations. The story of Rome is not merely a tale of conquest and empire, but a narrative woven with legend and myth. With the aspirations of shepherds who became kings, and kings who became gods. As you listen, allow your mind to drift freely through the mists of antiquity. Picture yourself standing on the banks of the Tiber River in ancient Italy, where 7 hills rise from the fertile plains of Latium. The air is warm, carrying the scent of Mediterranean pines and wild herbs. Here, in this peaceful landscape, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The echoes of history whisper through the centuries, calling us back to witness the moment when a small settlement of mud huts would become the eternal city, when Rome would rise to command the known world. Let these ancient stories wash over you like gentle waves, each detail building upon the last, creating a soothing rhythm that carries you deeper into restful sleep. The rise of Rome was not sudden, but gradual. Unfolding across generations like the slow growth of a mighty oak from a single acorn. In the beginning, there were 2 brothers, born under circumstances as extraordinary as their destiny would prove to be. Romulus and Remus entered the world as twins, the sons of Rhea Silvia, a Vestal virgin, and Mars, the fierce god of war himself. Their very existence was a violation of sacred law, for Rhea Silvia had been forced into her vows by her uncle Amulius, who had cruelly usurped the throne of Alba Longa from her father, King Numitor. Amulius had feared that any children born to his brother's line might one day reclaim the throne, and so he had condemned Rhea Silvia to a life of chastity as a Vestal virgin. But the gods had other plans. Mars, with his divine power, came to her, and from their union came the twin boys who would change the course of history. When Amulius discovered the infants, his rage knew no bounds. He ordered the babies drowned in the Tiber River, hoping to erase this threat to his stolen throne. The servants charged with this terrible task placed the helpless infants in a small woven basket and set them adrift on the swollen waters of the Tiber. But fate intervened, as it so often does in the stories of great heroes. The river, moved by forces beyond mortal understanding, carried the basket gently downstream until it came to rest at the base of the Palatine Hill, one of the 7 hills that would later form the heart of Rome. There, caught in the roots of a fig tree sacred to the god Rumina, the basket settled, and the baby's cries echoed through the wilderness. It was here that the most famous miracle of Rome's founding occurred. A she-wolf, drawn by the sound of the crying infants, came upon them. Instead of viewing them as prey, the wolf was moved by maternal instinct. She lifted the babies from their basket with gentle jaws and carried them to her den, a cave on the slope of the Palatine Hill that would later be known as the Lupercal. There, the wolf nursed the twins alongside her own cubs, while a woodpecker brought them food. Both animals sacred to Mars, their divine father. Days turned into weeks, and the twins thrived under this unlikely care until they were discovered by Faustulus, a shepherd who tended his flocks on the hillsides. Faustulus had seen the wolf caring for the children and, marveling at this wonder, waited for the right moment to take them. He brought the boys home to his wife, Acca Laurentia. And together they raised Romulus and Remus as their own sons, never revealing the truth of their noble birth or divine heritage. The twins grew strong and brave, natural leaders among the young shepherds and herdsmen of the region. They were quick to defend the weak and stood against injustice wherever they found it. Their reputation for courage and fairness spread throughout the countryside, and men began to follow them, drawn by their charisma and strength. Little did these followers know they were serving the grandsons of the rightful king of Alba Longa. The truth came to light when Remus was captured during a dispute with the herdsmen of Numitor. When Remus was brought before the old king, Numitor began to suspect the young man's true identity. The timing of his age, his noble bearing, and certain marks upon his body all suggested he might be one of the lost twins. Faustulus, seeing that the moment of revelation had come, told Romulus the truth of their birth. Romulus immediately gathered his followers and marched to Alba Longa to free his brother and confront Amulius. The confrontation was swift and violent. Romulus and Remus, united with their grandfather Numitor's supporters, stormed the palace and killed the usurper Amulius. The people of Alba Longa rejoiced at the return of their rightful king, and Numitor offered his grandsons a place in his court. But the twins, having tasted leadership and independence among the shepherds, had grander ambitions. They chose instead to found their own city at the place where they had been saved, where the she-wolf had nursed them, on the banks of the Tiber River. Yet even in this noble endeavor, conflict arose. The brothers could not agree on which of the 7 hills should serve as the site of their new city. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill, the very place where they had been rescued. Remus preferred the Aventine Hill, with its commanding views of the surrounding countryside. They decided to settle the matter through augury, seeking a sign from the gods by watching the flight of birds, an ancient Etruscan practice for divining the will of heaven. Remus, standing on the Aventine, saw 6 vultures fly overhead and proclaimed this a favorable omen. But Romulus, on the Palatine, counted 12 vultures circling above him. Each brother claimed victory. Remus argued he had seen the birds first, while Romulus insisted that the greater number favored him. The dispute grew heated, tensions rising as neither would yield to the other. Romulus proceeded with his plans, marking out the boundaries of his city on the Palatine Hill with a sacred furrow, plowing a line that would define the limits of his settlement. He declared that anyone who crossed this boundary would be put to death, for it was sacred ground, blessed by the gods. This ritual of marking city limits with a plowed furrow was an ancient tradition, creating a magical barrier between the civilized world within and the wild chaos beyond. Remus, perhaps in mockery, perhaps in genuine defiance, or maybe simply in thoughtless jest, jumped over Romulus's wall, scornfully demonstrating how easy it would be to breach. Whether Romulus struck him down himself in a fit of rage, or whether one of Romulus's followers killed Remus to uphold their leader's decree, the ancient sources disagree. But the outcome was the same. Remus lay dead, his blood staining the very ground that would become the foundation of Rome. Romulus, either in grief or grim determination, stood over his brother's body and declared words that would echo through the centuries. "So perish anyone else who shall leap over my walls." Thus, Rome was born in fratricide, on April 21 in the year 753 before the Common Era, founded by a man who had killed his own twin brother. This dark beginning would set a pattern for Roman history, a tale of power purchased through blood, of brothers turned enemies, of civil strife alongside external conquest. Yet from this violent seed would grow a civilization that would dominate the known world for over 1,000 years. Romulus became the first king of Rome, ruling over the small settlement of shepherds and adventurers who had followed him. He organized these men into centuries for military purposes and established the first Roman Senate, appointing 100 men to serve as advisors. These senators were called patres, or fathers, and their descendants would become the patrician class, the nobility of Rome. But Romulus faced a critical problem. His city had men in abundance. Warriors and builders, farmers and craftsmen, but it had almost no women. Without women, Rome would die in a single generation. Romulus attempted to negotiate marriage alliances with neighboring peoples, particularly the Sabines who lived in the nearby hills. But these neighboring communities saw Rome as little more than a den of outlaws and refugees, and they refused to allow their daughters to marry Roman men. Romulus realized he would need to use cunning where diplomacy had failed. He proclaimed a great festival in honor of Neptune, the god of horses, and invited all the neighboring peoples to attend, including the Sabines. Suspecting nothing, whole families came to witness the games and religious ceremonies. At a prearranged signal during the festivities, the young Romans surged forward and seized the unmarried Sabine women, carrying them away to become their brides. The Sabine men, caught unprepared and outnumbered, could only watch in fury as their daughters and sisters were abducted. They retreated to their own cities, swearing vengeance against Rome. This event, known as the Rape of the Sabines, would become one of the most controversial episodes in Rome's founding legend, inspiring countless works of art and literature through the ages. War came swiftly. The Sabine king, Titus Tatius, led his warriors against Rome to reclaim their women. Battles raged across the hills as Roman and Sabine forces clashed. But then something unexpected occurred. The Sabine women, who had been taken by force, stepped between the warring armies. They had come to care for their Roman husbands and had borne children to them. These women did not wish to see their fathers and brothers kill their husbands and the fathers of their children, nor did they want their husbands to kill their families. They pleaded for peace, their cries rising above the din of battle. Moved by the women's pleas, Romulus and Titus Tatius agreed to a truce. More than that, they agreed to merge their peoples into one, with Romulus and Titus Tatius ruling jointly as kings. The Sabines came to live on the Quirinal and Capitoline hills, and for a time, Rome prospered under this dual kingship. When Titus Tatius died 5 years later, Romulus became sole king again, but the union between Romans and Sabines remained, strengthening the young city and diversifying its population. Romulus reigned for 37 years, expanding Rome's territory and organizing its military and social structures. He established the first of Rome's great institutions and led his people in numerous wars against neighboring cities. Then, as mysteriously as his life had begun, it ended. According to legend, Romulus was reviewing his troops on the Campus Martius when a violent storm arose. Thunder shook the earth, and dark clouds descended, obscuring everything from view. When the storm cleared, Romulus had vanished. The senators claimed that Mars had taken his son up to heaven in the storm, transforming him into the god Quirinus. Not everyone believed this divine explanation. Some whispered that the senators, tired of Romulus's increasingly autocratic rule, had killed him during the storm and torn his body to pieces, hiding their crime behind the story of his apotheosis. But whether murdered by men or claimed by the gods, Romulus had passed from the mortal world, leaving behind a city that bore his name and would grow to rule the known world. The legend of the twin brothers raised by a wolf, one of whom would found Rome while the other's blood consecrated its walls, became the foundational myth of Roman identity, told and retold to every generation of Romans, a reminder of their city's extraordinary origins. After the disappearance of Romulus, Rome did not immediately choose another king. The senators debated among themselves, each patrician family hoping to claim the throne for one of their own. But the people and the senators eventually agreed that a new king should be chosen, and they selected a man very different from the warrior Romulus. His name was Numa Pompilius, a Sabine known throughout the region for his wisdom and piety. Numa had lived a quiet life in the Sabine hills, devoted to study and religious contemplation, far from the violent politics of Rome. When the Romans came to offer him the crown in 715 years before the Common Era, Numa was reluctant to accept, preferring his peaceful existence to the burden of kingship. But duty called, and Numa eventually agreed to rule. His reign, which lasted 43 years until his death in 673 before the Common Era, was marked not by conquest but by institution building. Where Romulus had been a man of war, Numa was a man of peace. He established Rome's religious calendar, organizing the year into 12 months and creating the system of festivals and holy days that would govern Roman worship for centuries. He designated priests for various gods, created the Vestal Virgins to tend the sacred flame of Vesta, and built temples throughout the city. Numa claimed to receive guidance from the nymph Egeria, who met him in a sacred grove and taught him divine wisdom. Whether this was literal truth or a poetic way of expressing his own deep contemplation, the Romans believed that Numa's laws and religious reforms were divinely inspired. He forbade the representation of the gods in human or animal form, keeping Roman worship more abstract and spiritual than that of the Greeks or Etruscans. He also established the cult of Quirinus, the deified Romulus, cementing his predecessor's place in the Roman pantheon. Under Numa's peaceful reign, Rome's borders remained stable, and the city turned inward, developing its social and religious institutions. The people learned the arts of agriculture and peace, and Numa taught them to honor the gods properly and to respect sacred oaths and treaties. When Numa died, the Romans mourned a king who had given them laws and faith, who had taught them that power need not always be expressed through violence. The third king could not have been more different from Numa. Tullus Hostilius, who reigned from 673 to 641 before the Common Era, was a warrior in the mold of Romulus. War had been absent from Rome during Numa's long peace, and Tullus believed that the young men had grown soft, that Rome needed conflict to maintain its martial vigor. He found his opportunity when disputes arose with Alba Longa, the mother city from which Rome had sprung, the city of Romulus's grandfather Numitor. Rather than commit both armies to wholesale slaughter, Tullus agreed to settle the dispute through a unique method. Each city would choose 3 champions, and these 6 men would fight to determine which city would rule the other. Rome selected the Horatii, 3 brothers known for their skill in combat. Alba Longa chose the Curiatii, also 3 brothers of equal repute. The 6 champions met on the field between the 2 cities while both armies watched. The battle was fierce. 2 of the Horatii fell quickly, wounded unto death, while all 3 Curiatii suffered injuries but remained standing. It seemed Alba Longa would win. But the surviving Horatius, seeing himself outnumbered but recognizing that his opponents were all wounded, employed a clever stratagem. He fled, knowing the wounded Curiatii would pursue him at different speeds depending on their injuries. As they spread out, he turned and faced them one at a time, killing each in single combat before the others could catch up. Rome won the contest, and Alba Longa became subject to Roman rule. Tullus continued his wars against other Latin cities and even fought the Sabines again. He destroyed Alba Longa entirely, depopulating the city and bringing its inhabitants to Rome, where they settled on the Celian hill, increasing Rome's population and territory. But Tullus grew arrogant in his success, neglecting the gods and the religious duties that Numa had so carefully established. According to legend, Jupiter himself struck down Tullus with lightning, burning him and his entire house, a divine punishment for his impiety. The 4th king, Ancus Marcius, grandson of Numa Pompilius, combined the qualities of his 2 predecessors. Reigning from 641 to 616 before the Common Era, Ancus was both warrior and builder, both conqueror and founder. He waged successful campaigns against the Latins, expanding Rome's territory to the sea and establishing Rome's first port at Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber River. This connection to the sea opened new avenues for trade and would eventually make Rome a naval power. Ancus also built the first bridge across the Tiber, the Pons Sublicius, connecting the city to lands on the western bank. He fortified Rome with a wooden palisade and extended the city's boundaries to include the Janiculum Hill. He built the first prison in Rome and established procedures for declaring war, creating the official priests who would perform the rituals that legitimized Roman military actions. Ancus's reign saw Rome grow from a city of 7 hills into a true regional power, with influence extending from the Apennine Mountains to the Tyrrhenian Sea. When Ancus died, the nature of Roman kingship changed dramatically. The next king was not Roman or even Latin, but Etruscan. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, called Tarquin the Elder, had been born in the Etruscan city of Tarquinii but had moved to Rome seeking greater opportunities. He was wealthy and ambitious, and through a combination of charm, generosity, and political acumen, he had become a trusted advisor to King Ancus. When Ancus died in 616 before the Common Era, Tarquin managed to have himself elected king, sidelining Ancus's own sons. Tarquin's reign from 616 to 579 before the Common Era marked a period of dramatic transformation for Rome. The Etruscans were the most advanced civilization in Italy at that time, with sophisticated art, architecture, and engineering. Tarquin brought Etruscan knowledge and culture to Rome, beginning massive building projects that would reshape the city. He laid out the Roman Forum, draining the marshy ground between the hills to create a central meeting place for commerce and politics. He began the construction of the great sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, which would carry wastewater out of the city for thousands of years to come. Tarquin also built the foundations of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, though it would not be completed until after his death. He expanded the Roman Senate, adding members from conquered Latin cities, and he reformed the Roman army, introducing Etruscan-style equipment and tactics. Under Tarquin, Rome began to look less like a rough settlement of shepherds and farmers and more like a true city, with public works, organized religion, and civic spaces. Tarquin was murdered in a conspiracy allegedly involving the sons of Ancus Marcius, who had never forgiven him for taking what they saw as their rightful throne. But Tarquin's son-in-law, who had married Tarquin's daughter, managed to seize power and became the 6th king. This was Servius Tullius, whose reign from 578 to 535 before the Common Era would be remembered as one of the most important in the kingdom's history. Servius Tullius was said to have been born a slave, the son of a captured Latin noblewoman, though some accounts suggest he was of divine birth. Regardless of his origins, Servius proved to be a reformer and builder of extraordinary capability. He reorganized Roman society, creating a new system based on property ownership rather than simply on patrician birth. He divided the people into classes according to wealth and assigned military duties based on these classifications. This Servian constitution would form the basis of the Roman Republic's later structure. Servius expanded Rome's boundary significantly, incorporating the Quirinal, Viminal, and Esquiline hills, and he built a new defensive wall around the expanded city, parts of which can still be seen in Rome today. He conducted the first census, counting all Roman citizens and their property, establishing a practice that would continue throughout Roman history. He built temples and shrines throughout the city and minted Rome's first coins. Under Servius, Rome became the dominant power in Latium, leading a league of Latin cities in mutual defense. But Servius met a terrible end. His daughter Tullia, married to his adopted son Lucius Tarquinius, was consumed by ambition. Along with her husband, she plotted against Servius. Lucius Tarquinius, grandson of Tarquin the Elder, believed he had a better claim to the throne than Servius. In 535 before the Common Era, he staged a coup, entering the Senate house and declaring himself king. When Servius rushed to confront him, Tarquin threw the old king down the Senate steps. Servius, injured and bleeding, staggered toward his home, but assassins sent by Tarquin hunted him down and killed him in the street. Tullia, hearing that her father was dead and her husband had taken the throne, drove her chariot through the city to celebrate. When she reached the spot where her father's body lay in the street, she drove her chariot over it, her wheels crushing her father's corpse, spattering herself with his blood. This Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, would be Rome's seventh and final king. His reign from 535 to 509 before the Common Era was marked by tyranny and oppression. He ruled without consulting the Senate, executed or exiled anyone he perceived as a threat, and funded his ambitious building projects through heavy taxation. He completed the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill and the Circus Maximus for chariot races. But these achievements could not overcome the hatred his subjects felt for him. Tarquin's downfall came through the actions of his son, Sextus Tarquinius. Sextus raped Lucretia, the virtuous wife of Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, a Roman nobleman and cousin of the king. Lucretia summoned her husband and father, told them what had happened, and then, declaring that no unchaste woman should live even if she had been violated against her will, stabbed herself to death before their eyes. Her suicide sparked outrage throughout Rome. Lucius Junius Brutus, a cousin of the king who had long pretended to be simple-minded to avoid Tarquin's suspicion, revealed his true intelligence and political acumen. He rallied the Roman people against the Tarquins. The revolution was swift and decisive. The Roman people rose up, drove Tarquin and his family from the city, and swore they would never again have a king. They razed Tarquin's property and threw his possessions into the Tiber River, creating, according to legend, the island that still exists in the river today. They established a new form of government, a republic, where power would be held not by a single king but by elected magistrates, checked and balanced by the Senate and the people. Brutus and Collatinus became the first consuls of the Roman Republic in 509 before the Common Era. The age of kings had ended. The age of the Republic had begun. The new Roman Republic was born in crisis. Tarquin the Proud did not accept his expulsion quietly. He sought allies among Rome's Etruscan neighbors, begging the powerful Etruscan city of Clusium for military support. Lars Porsena, the king of Clusium, marched on Rome with a massive Etruscan army, determined either to restore Tarquin to his throne or to conquer Rome for himself. The young republic faced its first great test, and its very survival hung in the balance. Legends from this period tell of extraordinary acts of courage that would define Roman virtue for generations to come. Horatius Coccles, a Roman warrior, held the narrow Sublician bridge across the Tiber single-handedly against the entire Etruscan army, while his fellow Romans destroyed the bridge behind him to prevent the enemy from crossing. When the bridge finally collapsed, Horatius, still in full armor, plunged into the Tiber and swam back to the Roman side. His impossible stand having bought Rome precious time. Gaius Mucius Scaevola volunteered to assassinate Lars Porsena. He infiltrated the Etruscan camp but killed the king's scribe by mistake, mistaking him for Porsena. When captured, Mucius thrust his right hand into a fire and held it there without flinching, burning it away to punish it for its failure. Impressed by such courage, Porsena made peace with Rome. Whether these tales are literally true or embellished over time, they reflect the values the Romans most admired. Courage in the face of impossible odds, self-sacrifice for the good of the state, and determination never to surrender. These stories were told to every Roman child, instilling the virtues that would make Rome great. The early republic struggled to define itself, torn between the patrician class, who claimed descent from the original senators appointed by Romulus, and the plebeians, the common people who made up the bulk of Rome's population. The patricians held all political power, monopolizing the consulship and the Senate. They alone could serve as priests in the most important religious ceremonies. They controlled the interpretation of the law, which was not written down but passed orally from generation to generation, allowing them to manipulate legal proceedings to their advantage. The plebeians, despite being the majority of the population and providing most of Rome's soldiers, had no formal political power and no protection under the law. They could be arrested and imprisoned by patrician magistrates without trial. They were forbidden from marrying patricians. When they fell into debt, they could be sold into slavery by their creditors. This inequality could not stand indefinitely, and tensions between the classes grew until they exploded in the first secession of the plebs in 494 before the Common Era. The plebeians, pushed too far by patrician oppression, withdrew from Rome entirely, marching to the Sacred Mount about 3 miles from the city and threatening to found their own city, leaving Rome to the patricians alone. Without the plebeians, Rome would have no army, no labor force, no economic base. The patricians, forced to negotiate, granted the plebeians the right to elect their own officers, called tribunes of the plebs, who could veto actions by patrician magistrates and defend plebeian interests. This was only the first of several secessions and the beginning of a long struggle between the classes known as the conflict of the orders. In 450 before the Common Era, the plebeians won another major victory, the Law of the 12 Tables, Rome's first written law code. A special commission of 10 men, the Decemvirs, was appointed to write down the laws, making them public and preventing patricians from twisting unwritten laws to their advantage. The 12 Tables covered everything from property rights to family law, from criminal penalties to funeral regulations. Though harsh by modern standards, mandating the death penalty for many offenses, the 12 Tables established the principle that law should be known and public, not the secret preserve of the aristocracy. Gradually, over the next 2 centuries, plebeians gained more and more rights. They won the right to marry patricians in 445 before the Common Era. They gained access to the consulship, Rome's highest office, in 367 before the Common Era. Eventually, they could hold any office in Rome, serve in the Senate, and act as priests in major religious ceremonies. The conflict of the orders, while bitter at times, was resolved without destroying Rome. And the integration of plebeian talent and energy into the Roman state made the Republic stronger. While managing internal conflicts, Rome also faced external threats. The Gauls, a Celtic people from north of the Alps, invaded Italy in the early 4th century before the Common Era. In 390 before the Common Era, a Gallic war band led by the chieftain Brennus smashed the Roman army at the Battle of the Allia and sacked Rome itself. The Gauls occupied the city for months. And Rome was only saved when the Romans agreed to pay an enormous ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold. When the Romans complained that the weights the Gauls used were rigged to cheat them, Brennus threw his sword onto the scale as well, adding its weight to the gold demanded, and spoke words that would haunt Roman memory. Vi victis, woe to the conquered. This humiliation burned in the Roman mind. They rebuilt their walls, making them stronger, and they vowed never again to be caught unprepared. The sack of Rome by the Gauls became a defining trauma, a shame that needed to be avenged. For centuries afterward, Romans feared another Gallic invasion, and the memory drove them to expand their power and ensure their security through the conquest of their neighbors. Rome methodically absorbed the other cities and peoples of central Italy. They fought the Samnites, a tough mountain people, in 3 brutal wars spanning nearly 50 years. They conquered the Etruscans, their former masters and teachers, city by city. They subjugated the other Latin cities, binding them to Rome through a system of alliances that gave Rome control of their foreign policy and military forces while allowing them some internal autonomy. By 275 before the Common Era, Rome controlled all of peninsular Italy south of the Po River Valley. Rome's control was not that of a simple conqueror. They incorporated defeated peoples into the Roman system through a brilliant strategy of differentiated statuses. Some became full Roman citizens with all rights and duties. Others became allies, maintaining their own governments but bound to provide troops to Rome when called upon. Some had limited citizenship without the right to vote in Roman assemblies. This system allowed Rome to draw on the military manpower of all Italy while preventing unified rebellion, since different communities had different stakes in the Roman system. This period also saw Rome face Pyrrhus of Epirus, considered one of the great generals of the Hellenistic world, a worthy successor to Alexander the Great. Pyrrhus came to Italy in 280 before the Common Era to aid the Greek city of Tarentum against Rome. He won several battles against the Romans, but at such terrible cost to his own forces that we still speak of Pyrrhic victories to describe wins that cost more than their worth. After years of inconclusive fighting, Pyrrhus abandoned Italy, famously remarking that one more such victory would utterly undo him. Rome had survived its first encounter with Hellenistic military power and emerged stronger. By the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, Rome dominated Italy. The Republic's legions were the most powerful military force in the Western Mediterranean. Rome's political system, though still evolving, had achieved a workable balance between different social classes and interests. The Republic was poised to burst beyond the confines of Italy and seek dominance across the Mediterranean world. But to do so, they would have to confront an equally powerful rival, an ancient city that controlled the sea lanes and commanded vast wealth and military might. They would have to face Carthage. Carthage stood as the greatest power in the Western Mediterranean, a Phoenician city on the coast of North Africa that had built a maritime empire of staggering wealth and extent. Founded in 814 before the Common Era by colonists from the Phoenician city of Tyre, Carthage controlled most of North Africa's coast from Libya to the Atlantic, dominated southern Spain with its rich silver mines, and held the islands of Sardinia, Corsica, and western Sicily. Their navy was the finest in the Mediterranean, their merchants the most far-reaching, their wealth immense beyond Roman comprehension. For centuries, Rome and Carthage had been cordial, even allies at times. Treaties signed in 509, 348, and around 279 before the Common Era defined spheres of influence and established trade agreements. During Rome's struggle against Pyrrhus, Carthage had provided material support, seeing the Greek king as a common threat. The two powers seemed to have little reason for conflict, operating as they did in different spheres, Rome on land and Carthage on sea. But in 264 before the Common Era, events in Sicily pulled the two powers into conflict. The Mamertines, Italian mercenaries who had seized the Sicilian city of Messana, appealed to both Rome and Carthage for protection against Syracuse, the dominant Greek city in Sicily. Carthage responded first, sending a garrison to Messana. But the Mamertines, fearing Carthaginian control, then appealed to Rome as well. The Roman Senate debated. Aiding pirates and brigands, which is what the Mamertines were, seemed beneath Rome's dignity. But Messana controlled the strait between Italy and Sicily, a strategic position of immense importance. The People's Assembly, influenced by the prestige and plunder a successful war might bring, voted to send help to the Mamertines. When Roman forces arrived at Messana and demanded the Carthaginians leave, Carthage refused. The First Punic War had begun. The Romans called it the Punic War because Punic was their word for Phoenician, the ancestry of the Carthaginians. The war would last 23 years, from 264 to 241 before the Common Era, longer than any previous war in Mediterranean history. Most of the fighting took place on Sicily and in the seas around it, a grinding war of sieges and naval battles that neither side seemed able to win decisively. Rome had never been a naval power. The Romans were soldiers of the land, not sailors. But they could not hope to defeat Carthage without challenging Carthaginian control of the sea. With characteristic Roman determination and engineering genius, they built a navy from nothing. According to the historian Polybius, they found a wrecked Carthaginian warship washed up on shore and used it as a model, constructing an entire fleet by copying its design. Within 60 days, they had built 100 warships and trained crews to sail them. But the Romans knew their sailors could not match Carthaginian skill in seamanship and naval maneuvers. So they invented a new weapon, the corvus, or raven, a boarding bridge with a heavy spike on the end. When a Roman ship came alongside a Carthaginian vessel, the corvus would drop, the spike piercing the enemy deck and locking the ships together. Roman marines would then storm across the bridge, turning a naval battle into the kind of infantry fight where Roman legionaries excelled. This innovation allowed Rome to win its first major naval battle at Mylae in 260 before the Common Era. The war ground on. Rome won naval victories but lost ships to storms, as their hastily built fleet proved less seaworthy than Carthaginian vessels designed by generations of master shipwrights. Both sides suffered terrible casualties. Rome launched an invasion of North Africa under the consul Regulus, who initially succeeded but was eventually defeated and captured. The fighting in Sicily continued year after year, with cities changing hands, territories devastated, and both sides exhausted. Finally, in 241 before the Common Era, Rome built yet another fleet, this time funded by private loans from wealthy citizens since the state treasury was empty. In a naval battle off the Aegates Islands near western Sicily, the Roman fleet caught a Carthaginian supply convoy and destroyed it. With their supply line cut and no money left to continue the war, Carthage sued for peace. The treaty was harsh. Carthage had to evacuate all of Sicily, pay a massive indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver over 10 years, and give up all prisoners without ransom while paying for the return of Carthaginian prisoners. Sicily became Rome's first province outside of Italy, the first piece of Rome's overseas empire. The peace did not last. Carthage faced a terrible rebellion of its unpaid mercenary armies in North Africa, a conflict so brutal it was called the Truceless War. While Carthage struggled to survive this internal threat, Rome seized the opportunity to take Sardinia and Corsica from the weakened Carthaginians, adding insult to injury and planting seeds of resentment that would flower into renewed war. Carthage, to recover from its losses and to gain resources for revenge, expanded its holdings in Spain under the general Hamilcar Barca and later his son-in-law Hasdrubal. When Hasdrubal was assassinated in 221 before the Common Era, command in Spain passed to Hamilcar's son, a brilliant young general named Hannibal Barca. Hannibal had been raised to hate Rome. According to legend, as a child of 9, his father had made him swear an oath at the altar that he would never be a friend to Rome. Now, at age 26, Hannibal commanded Carthage's armies in Spain, and he looked for an opportunity to renew the struggle with Rome. That opportunity came when Hannibal besieged Saguntum, a Spanish city allied with Rome, in 219 before the Common Era. The siege lasted 8 months. Rome demanded Hannibal lift the siege. Hannibal refused. When Saguntum finally fell, Rome declared war. The Second Punic War, the most famous of the 3 conflicts between Rome and Carthage, had begun. It would last 17 years and bring Rome to the brink of destruction. Hannibal did not wait for Rome to bring the war to him. In a campaign of breathtaking audacity, he decided to invade Italy itself, to strike at the heart of Roman power. In the spring of 218 before the Common Era, Hannibal departed from New Carthage in Spain with an army of about 40,000 infantry, 10,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. He marched through southern France, across the Rhone River, and then, in one of history's most famous military marches, crossed the Alps into Italy. The Alpine crossing was a nightmare that tested human endurance to its absolute limits. It was late autumn, and early snow had already begun to fall in the high passes, transforming narrow mountain paths into treacherous corridors of death. The trails were barely wide enough for the elephants, and when these massive beasts lost their footing on ice-covered slopes, they tumbled to their deaths in the gorges below, taking their handlers and nearby soldiers with them. The thin mountain air made breathing difficult, and the altitude sickness weakened even the strongest warriors. Gallic tribes inhabiting these mountains, hostile to any army crossing their territory, launched devastating ambushes, rolling massive boulders down onto the snaking column below, crushing men and animals alike. The sound of these rocks thundering down the mountainside, mixing with the screams of dying soldiers, created a symphony of horror that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Supplies ran desperately short as the journey took longer than anticipated. The men survived on whatever they could find, including the flesh of horses and pack animals that had died along the way. The cold was so bitter that men wrapped themselves in the still warm hides of freshly slaughtered animals just to survive the nights. Many soldiers simply froze to death while sleeping, their bodies discovered stiff and lifeless when morning came. The elephants, magnificent creatures bred in the warm climate of North Africa, suffered terribly in the alpine cold. Their thick hides, which seemed so tough in battle, offered little protection against frost and ice. One by one, these mighty beasts collapsed and died, until only a handful remained. The men themselves lost fingers and toes to frostbite, and many went snowblind from the endless glare of sunlight on snow. When Hannibal finally descended into the Po River valley of northern Italy after 15 days in the mountains, his army had been reduced to about 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry from the nearly 60,000 men who had begun the journey. Most of the elephants had died, their frozen corpses marking the trail through the Alps like monuments to Hannibal's audacity. But he had achieved what Romans had thought impossible. He had brought a Carthaginian army into the heart of Italy itself, bypassing Rome's naval defenses entirely. The Romans were caught completely off guard. They had expected to fight in Spain or Africa, not in Italy itself. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had been en route to Spain, rushed back to confront Hannibal at the Ticinus River. In the brief cavalry engagement that followed, the Romans were badly beaten. And Scipio himself was wounded and nearly killed, saved only by his teenage son's courage. The Romans fell back, gathering more forces. At the Trebia River in December of 218 before the Common Era, Hannibal lured the Romans into battle on his terms. He positioned his forces with the river at the Romans' backs and drew them into a trap. Hidden Carthaginian cavalry and infantry fell upon the Roman flanks and rear. Most of the Roman army was destroyed. The few survivors staggered back to safety, but Rome had lost 2/3 of its forces. Northern Italy lay open to Hannibal. The Senate appointed new consuls for the following year and sent them north with fresh armies to stop Hannibal's advance. In the spring of 217 before the Common Era, at Lake Trasimene in central Italy, Hannibal set an ambush that remains one of history's most perfect tactical accomplishments. He hid his forces in the hills overlooking a narrow valley beside the lake, waiting for the Roman army to march through. When the Romans entered the valley on a foggy morning, Hannibal's troops descended from the heights, trapping the Roman column between the hills and the lake. The battle was more massacre than fight. 15,000 Romans were killed, including the consul Gaius Flaminius. 15,000 more were captured. Hannibal's forces suffered minimal losses. Rome panicked. Hannibal was loose in Italy, destroying every army sent against him. The Senate took emergency measures, appointing Quintus Fabius Maximus as dictator with absolute power. Fabius adopted a new strategy. Rather than risking another pitched battle, he shadowed Hannibal's army, harassing it, cutting off stragglers, preventing it from foraging, but never engaging in direct combat. This strategy denied Hannibal the decisive victory he needed but frustrated the Romans, who wanted a quick resolution. They called Fabius Cunctator, the delayer, and it was not meant as a compliment. When Fabius's term as dictator ended, Rome elected new consuls who rejected his cautious approach. The consuls Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro raised the largest army Rome had ever fielded, some 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, and marched south to confront Hannibal at Cannae in Apulia in 216 before the Common Era. The Battle of Cannae remains one of history's most studied military engagements. Hannibal had about 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, outnumbered almost 2-to-1 in infantry though with superior cavalry. He arranged his forces in a deliberately weak center, a thin line of Spanish and Gallic troops, with his veteran African infantry on the flanks and his cavalry on the wings. The Romans, seeing the weak center, attacked it in a massive column, pushing the Carthaginian line back in a controlled retreat. But this was exactly what Hannibal wanted. As the Roman mass pushed forward, the Carthaginian line bent backward into a crescent shape, channeling the Romans into an ever-tightening pocket. The Carthaginian cavalry defeated the Roman cavalry on both wings and then swept around to attack the Roman infantry from behind. The African infantry on the Carthaginian flanks turned inward and attacked the Roman column from the sides. The Romans found themselves completely surrounded, packed so tightly they could barely fight. It became a slaughter. By the end of the day, somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans lay dead, including the consul Paulus and 80 senators who had volunteered to fight. Varro escaped with a remnant of the army. It was Rome's worst military defeat ever. After Cannae, many believed Rome was finished. Several Italian cities and peoples that had been allied or subject to Rome defected to Hannibal, including Capua, the second largest city in Italy. Syracuse in Sicily rebelled against Roman rule. Philip V of Macedon allied with Hannibal, threatening Rome from the east. But Rome did not surrender. The Senate refused even to discuss peace terms. They raised new armies, freeing slaves to serve as soldiers, arming men as young as 17. They appointed Fabius's former strategy, avoiding battle with Hannibal while attacking Carthaginian allies and cutting off his supplies and reinforcements. Hannibal remained in Italy for 13 more years, campaigning across the south, winning battles, but unable to strike the knockout blow that would end Rome. Without siege equipment, he could not take Rome itself. His allies in Italy could not provide enough reinforcements to replace his losses. Carthage, focused on defending Spain and Africa, sent little help. Meanwhile, Rome ground down Carthaginian power through attrition, retaking rebellious cities one by one, brutally punishing those that had defected. In Spain, a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the Scipio who had been wounded at Ticinus, won a series of brilliant victories against the Carthaginian armies there, conquering Carthage's Spanish territories and depriving them of their richest source of revenue and manpower. In 204 before the Common Era, Scipio convinced the Senate to let him take the war directly to Africa. Scipio landed in North Africa with an army and began ravaging Carthaginian territory. Carthage, desperate, recalled Hannibal from Italy. After 15 years away, Hannibal left Italy, never to return. He gathered what forces Carthage could provide and marched to face Scipio. The two greatest generals of the age met at Zama in 202 before the Common Era. At Zama, Hannibal tried to repeat his tactics from Cannae, but Scipio had studied Hannibal's methods and prepared countermeasures. The Carthaginian elephant charge was channeled into lanes where the Romans could destroy the beasts without disrupting their formation. The cavalry battle, which had been Rome's weakness, went to Scipio's Roman and Numidian cavalry. When Hannibal's cavalry fled the field, Scipio's cavalry pursued briefly, then returned to strike Hannibal's infantry from behind, just as Hannibal had done to the Romans at Cannae. The battle was a devastating Carthaginian defeat. Hannibal escaped, but Carthage's army was broken. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were severe. Carthage had to give up all territory outside of Africa, surrender its fleet except for 10 ships, pay an indemnity of 10,000 talents over 50 years, and agree not to wage war without Roman permission. Hannibal survived and even served as chief magistrate of Carthage for a time, trying to rebuild his city, but Rome never forgot him. Years later, threatened with extradition to Rome, Hannibal took poison rather than fall into Roman hands. The Second Punic War had cost Rome terribly. Hundreds of thousands of Romans and Italian allies had died. Italy's countryside had been devastated by years of warfare. But Rome had survived what should have destroyed it, and in doing so had proven its extraordinary resilience. Now Rome was unquestionably the dominant power in the Western Mediterranean. The Third Punic War was almost anticlimactic after the epic struggle of the Second. Carthage had recovered economically despite the harsh peace terms, and some Romans feared this resurgence. Marcus Porcius Cato, a senior senator, ended every speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of topic, with the words, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. When Carthage, provoked by raids from Numidia, defended itself militarily in violation of the treaty ending the Second Punic War, Rome declared war in 149 before the Common Era. The Third Punic War was a siege. The Romans surrounded Carthage and blockaded it by land and sea. The Carthaginians, though outnumbered and with no hope of victory, defended their city with desperate courage for 3 years. When the Romans finally breached the walls in 146 before the Common Era, they fought from house to house, street to street. The siege and final assault killed most of Carthage's population. The survivors were sold into slavery. The Romans burned the city, demolished its walls and buildings, and plowed the ground with salt in a symbolic gesture, though whether this actually rendered the land infertile or was merely ritual is debated. Carthage, Rome's greatest rival, was utterly destroyed. Its territory became the Roman province of Africa. Rome now controlled the entire Western Mediterranean. Nearly a century after the fall of Carthage, Rome had expanded dramatically. It controlled Spain, southern France, Greece, much of the Middle East, and North Africa. But the republic that had defeated Hannibal and conquered the Mediterranean was tearing itself apart from within. The old balance between patricians and plebeians, between senate and people, between law and military might, was breaking down. Into this crisis stepped a man who would change Rome forever, Gaius Julius Caesar. Caesar was born in 100 years before the Common Era into an ancient patrician family that claimed descent from Iulus, son of the Trojan hero Aeneas, and thus from the goddess Venus herself. But despite their noble lineage, Caesar's family was not particularly wealthy or politically powerful. Caesar rose through a combination of intelligence, charisma, military genius, political acumen, and ruthless ambition. As a young man, Caesar made powerful friends and equally powerful enemies. He married Cornelia, daughter of Cinna, a leader of the populares, the political faction that claimed to represent the common people against the aristocratic Optimates who dominated the Senate. When Sulla, leader of the Optimates, became dictator and began purging his enemies, Caesar's connection to Cinna put him in danger. Sulla ordered Caesar to divorce Cornelia, but Caesar refused, fleeing Rome instead. He eventually received a pardon, but his defiance of Sulla made his courage and principles known. Caesar served in the army, winning awards for bravery, then returned to Rome to pursue a political career. He was a gifted orator, skilled in rhetoric and courtroom advocacy. He also began spending money he did not have, building support through generosity and public spectacles, going deep into debt to finance his political rise. He allied himself with two of Rome's most powerful men, Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and Pompey, Rome's greatest general. This informal alliance, later called the First Triumvirate, allowed all three men to advance their goals while circumventing the Senate's opposition. In 59 before the Common Era, Caesar became consul, Rome's highest office. He used the position to pass legislation favorable to his allies and to arrange his own appointment as proconsul of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum for an unprecedented 5-year term. This gave Caesar command of 4 legions and control of territories that bordered on unconquered lands ripe for conquest. Caesar saw an opportunity to achieve military glory, political power, and the wealth he needed to pay his massive debts. Gaul, the region we know today as France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland and Germany, was inhabited by Celtic tribes whom the Romans called Gauls. Some Gallic tribes were allied with Rome, others were neutral, and some were hostile. When the Helvetii, a tribe from what is now Switzerland, planned a massive migration westward across Gaul, potentially destabilizing the entire region, Caesar saw his chance. In 58 before the Common Era, Caesar intercepted the Helvetii and, after initial negotiations failed, defeated them in battle, forcing them to return to their homeland. He then turned his attention to the Germanic king Ariovistus, who had settled in Gaul with his tribe and was threatening Rome's Gallic allies. Caesar defeated Ariovistus's forces in a hard-fought battle and drove the Germans back across the Rhine River. Thus began the Gallic Wars, a 9-year campaign in which Caesar conquered all of Gaul and briefly invaded Britain and Germany. He faced brave opponents, difficult terrain, and the constant challenge of supply and logistics. He fought the Belgi in the north, the Veneti along the Atlantic coast, various German tribes across the Rhine, and countless other Gallic peoples. Caesar's military genius showed itself in siege warfare, bridge building, and tactical innovation. He built a bridge across the Rhine in 10 days, a feat of engineering that awed both his men and his enemies. He invaded Britain twice, in 55 and 54 before the Common Era, the first Roman general to cross the ocean to that mysterious island. The culmination of the Gallic Wars came in 52 before the Common Era when a young Gallic nobleman named Vercingetorix united many of the Gallic tribes in a coordinated rebellion against Rome. Vercingetorix was a skilled leader who employed guerrilla tactics, avoiding pitched battles and using scorched earth policies to deny Caesar supplies. But at the fortified town of Alesia, Vercingetorix made a stand. Caesar besieged the town with 6 legions. The siege of Alesia became one of history's most remarkable military achievements. Caesar's forces built 2 sets of fortifications, an inner wall to keep Vercingetorix's forces penned in Alesia, and an outer wall to defend against the Gallic relief army that was marching to rescue Vercingetorix. The Romans were essentially besieging Alesia while being besieged themselves by the relief force. When the relief army arrived, estimated at 250,000 men according to Caesar's own account. Though modern historians consider this figure greatly exaggerated, the Romans found themselves attacked from both directions. The battle raged for days. The Gauls threw everything they had against the Roman fortifications, while inside Alesia, Vercingetorix's forces tried to break out. But Caesar's defensive works held. His men repelled every assault. Eventually, the relief army withdrew, and Vercingetorix, his people starving and his position hopeless, surrendered to save his remaining followers. Caesar imprisoned Vercingetorix, keeping him alive for 6 years until he could be paraded through Rome in a triumph before being ritually strangled. Gaul was conquered. Caesar wrote detailed accounts of his campaigns in Gaul, the Commentarii de Bello Gallico, which survive to this day. These commentaries served multiple purposes. They were military history, they were propaganda justifying his actions, and they were political advertisements demonstrating his genius to the Roman people. Written in clear, elegant Latin, they remain some of the finest prose in the Latin language and are still read by students learning Latin today. But while Caesar was conquering Gaul, politics in Rome had become increasingly violent and chaotic. Crassus had died leading a disastrous campaign against the Parthians in the east. Pompey, without Crassus to balance him and Caesar, had moved closer to the Senate and the Optimates. The Senate, fearing Caesar's growing power and popularity, demanded he disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar knew this would leave him vulnerable to prosecution by his enemies. Instead, in 49 before the Common Era, Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, the boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper, with a single legion. Alia iacta est, he reportedly said, the die is cast. Crossing the Rubicon with an army was an act of treason that began a civil war. Pompey and the Senate fled to Greece, where they raised armies to oppose Caesar. But Caesar moved with lightning speed, securing Italy, then Spain, then pursuing Pompey to Greece. At Pharsalus in Thessaly in 48 before the Common Era, despite being outnumbered, Caesar's veteran legions shattered Pompey's larger force. Pompey fled to Egypt, where the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII, hoping to curry favor with Caesar, had Pompey murdered and presented his severed head to Caesar as a gift. Caesar, rather than being pleased, was reportedly disgusted by the murder of his former ally and son-in-law, for Pompey had been married to Caesar's daughter Julia before her death. Caesar remained in Egypt, becoming entangled in the civil war between Ptolemy and his sister Cleopatra VII. Caesar allied with Cleopatra, defeated Ptolemy's forces, and installed Cleopatra as ruler of Egypt. Caesar and Cleopatra became lovers, and she would later bear a son she claimed was Caesar's, naming him Caesar Ion. After securing Egypt, Caesar campaigned in Asia Minor, where he won a swift victory and sent the famous message to the Senate. Veni, vidi, vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. He then returned to Africa to defeat the remaining senatorial forces loyal to Pompey's cause, and finally to Spain to crush the last resistance. By 45 before the Common Era, Caesar had defeated all his opponents and was undisputed master of Rome. The Senate, packed with Caesar's supporters and cowed by his victories, granted him honor after honor. He was made dictator, first for 10 years, then for life. He was granted the title Imperator, originally a military acclamation but becoming a permanent part of his name. His image appeared on coins while he was still alive, unprecedented for a living Roman. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar with its 12 months and 365 days, adding a leap day every 4 years. The month of his birth, formerly Quintilis, was renamed Julius in his honor, giving us July. But Caesar's increasing power and his apparent intention to become a monarch alarmed many Romans. The Republic had been founded on the principle that no single man should hold absolute power, that tyranny was the ultimate political evil. A group of senators, calling themselves the Liberators and including Caesar's friend Marcus Junius Brutus and his former lieutenant Gaius Cassius Longinus, formed a conspiracy to kill Caesar and restore the Republic. On the Ides of March, the 15th of March, 44 before the Common Era, as Caesar entered the Senate house for a meeting, the conspirators surrounded him and struck. They stabbed him 23 times. According to legend, when Caesar saw Brutus among his attackers, he said, "Et tu, Brute? And you, Brutus?" Though this phrase may be Shakespeare's invention rather than historical fact. Caesar fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, his former ally and rival. The assassins expected to be hailed as heroes for saving the Republic. Instead, Rome descended into chaos. Caesar's lieutenant Mark Antony seized power in Rome. Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir Octavian, a young man of 19, claimed his inheritance and raised an army. Another series of civil wars began, but this time they would not end with the restoration of the Republic. They would end with the birth of the Roman Empire. Gaius Octavius, later called Octavian and finally Augustus, was only 18 years old when Julius Caesar was assassinated. He was the son of Caesar's niece Asia and had been raised partly in Caesar's household. Despite his youth and lack of military or political experience, Octavian possessed several crucial advantages. Caesar had adopted him posthumously in his will, making Octavian legally Caesar's son and heir. Caesar had also left Octavian 3/4 of his estate, an enormous fortune. Most importantly, Octavian had the name Caesar, which had become synonymous with military victory and charismatic leadership. Soldiers who had served under Julius Caesar transferred their loyalty to his heir. Octavian traveled to Rome and claimed his inheritance. Mark Antony, who had been Caesar's closest ally and who had seized power in the chaos after the assassination, initially dismissed the young man as a boy playing at politics. But Octavian proved far more capable and ruthless than anyone expected. He raised an army from Caesar's veterans, seduced 2 of Antony's legions into defecting, and maneuvered the Senate into appointing him to a military command despite his youth. When Antony was defeated in battle by forces loyal to the Senate, he fled north. Octavian, realizing that the Senate meant to use him and then dispose of him once Antony was eliminated, marched on Rome with 8 legions and forced the Senate to make him consul, at age 19, the youngest consul in Roman history. He then reached an agreement with Antony and another of Caesar's lieutenants, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. The 3 men formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal dictatorship with absolute power. The triumvir's first act was to proscribe their enemies, declaring lists of men to be killed and their property confiscated. Hundreds of senators and thousands of equestrians were murdered, including the great orator Cicero, who had supported Octavian against Antony but had made the fatal error of insulting Antony in his speeches. Antony had Cicero's head and hands cut off and displayed on the speaker's platform in the forum as a warning to others. With their enemies eliminated, the triumvirs turned their attention to Caesar's assassins, who had fled to the eastern provinces and raised armies. In 42 before the Common Era, at Philippi in Macedonia, Octavian and Antony's forces met the armies of Brutus and Cassius in 2 battles. The liberators were defeated, and both Brutus and Cassius committed suicide. Caesar had been avenged. The triumvirs divided the Roman world among themselves. Antony took the wealthy eastern provinces. Octavian took the west, including Italy, but also the responsibility of settling the triumvirate's veterans on land, a task that made him many enemies as he confiscated property to give to soldiers. Lepidus received Africa, the smallest share. But this arrangement could not last. Lepidus attempted to seize Sicily from Octavian and was defeated and forced into retirement. Now only Octavian and Antony remained. Antony had established himself in the east and allied with Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, Julius Caesar's former lover. Antony and Cleopatra became lovers themselves, and Cleopatra bore him 3 children. Antony divorced Octavian's sister Octavia, whom he had married to cement his alliance with Octavian, and married Cleopatra instead, though this marriage was not recognized under Roman law. Antony also distributed Roman territories to Cleopatra and her children, styling himself as a Hellenistic monarch rather than a Roman leader. Octavian used this brilliantly for propaganda purposes. He portrayed Antony as a traitor to Rome, bewitched by a foreign queen, more Egyptian than Roman. He emphasized Cleopatra as the threat, a foreign monarch seeking to dominate Rome, rather than focusing on Antony directly, which might have seemed like another civil war between Romans. In 31 before the Common Era, Octavian persuaded the Senate to declare war not on Antony but on Cleopatra. The two forces met at Actium, on the western coast of Greece, in a naval battle in September of 31 before the Common Era. The battle was indecisive until Cleopatra, seeing her fleet surrounded, broke through the blockade with her ships and fled back to Egypt. Antony, rather than continuing the fight, abandoned his fleet and followed Cleopatra, leaving his army and navy to surrender to Octavian. The next year, Octavian invaded Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra both committed suicide rather than be captured. Octavian had their son Caesar Ion, Caesar's only biological son, quietly executed, eliminating a potential rival. Egypt became a Roman province, personally controlled by Octavian. Octavian returned to Rome in 29 before the Common Era as the undisputed master of the Roman world. He was only 33 years old, yet he commanded all Rome's armies and controlled all its provinces. But Octavian had learned from Julius Caesar's mistake. Caesar's open assumption of monarchical power had led to his assassination. Octavian would be more subtle, hiding his autocracy behind a facade of restored republican government. In 27 before the Common Era, Octavian made a theatrical gesture before the Senate. He announced he was restoring the republic, giving up his extraordinary powers, and returning the provinces and armies to the Senate's control. The Senate, of course, refused to accept this resignation. They knew Octavian controlled the armies, and they could not govern without military force to back them. So they granted Octavian a series of constitutional powers and honors that, taken together, gave him control of the state while maintaining the appearance that the republic still functioned. He was granted proconsular imperium over the provinces containing the majority of the legions, giving him control of the military. He became princeps senatus, first among equals in the Senate, though in practice he was far more than equal. The Senate granted him the name Augustus, meaning revered or exalted, a semi-religious title that elevated him above ordinary mortals without making him a king. From this point on, Gaius Octavius was known as Augustus, and we date his reign from this moment, 27 years before the Common Era. Augustus ruled for 44 years, until his death in 14 of the Common Era. His reign transformed Rome from a republic constantly torn by civil war into a stable empire at peace. This peace, called the Pax Romana or Roman peace, would last for 2 centuries. Augustus closed the gates of the Temple of Janus, a symbolic act performed only when Rome was at peace, 3 times during his reign, the first time they had been closed in 200 years. Augustus reformed every aspect of Roman government. He created a permanent civil service to administer the empire, replacing the ad hoc system where magistrates' friends handled provincial administration. He established the Praetorian Guard, an elite military unit to serve as his bodyguard and the garrison of Rome. He reformed the tax system, making it more efficient and less corrupt. He rebuilt Rome in marble, constructing new forums, temples, theaters, and public buildings. "I found Rome a city of brick," he later boasted, and left it a city of marble. The empire expanded under Augustus. He added Egypt, large parts of Spain, regions along the Danube, and territories in Germany, though a disastrous defeat in the Teutoburg forest in 9 of the Common Era, where 3 legions were annihilated, convinced Augustus to establish the Rhine and Danube rivers as the empire's northern frontier rather than continuing expansion into Germany. By the end of Augustus's reign, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Euphrates River, encompassing the entire Mediterranean basin and much of Western Europe. Augustus also ensured the imperial succession. Having no sons of his own, he adopted his stepson Tiberius as his heir and granted him powers equal to his own in the final years of his life. When Augustus died peacefully in 14 of the Common Era at age 75, Tiberius smoothly succeeded him as the second emperor. The Roman Empire had become an established fact, and the Republic was gone forever, living on only in ceremonial forms and nostalgic memories. The Roman Empire at its height was a marvel of organization, engineering, and culture. It was the most powerful state the Western world had yet seen, controlling territory inhabited by perhaps 70 million people, one-third of the world's population at the time. What made Rome remarkable was not just its size but how it functioned, how it connected such vast territories and diverse peoples into a single coherent civilization. Roads were the arteries of the empire, and Rome built them as no civilization before had. Roman roads were engineering marvels, constructed to last for centuries. They began with a foundation of large stones, then layers of progressively smaller stones and gravel, topped with carefully fitted paving stones, creating a cambered surface that shed water into drainage ditches on either side. These roads were so well built that many are still in use today. 2,000 years later, either preserved as historical monuments or serving as the foundations for modern roads. The Romans built over 250,000 miles of roads, enough to circle the earth 10 times. The most famous was the Appian Way, begun in 312 before the Common Era, which ran from Rome's southeast to Brundisium, Rome's main port for travel to Greece. Other major roads connected Rome to every corner of the empire. These roads allowed rapid movement of armies, enabling Rome to respond quickly to threats on distant frontiers. They also facilitated trade and communication, binding the empire together. A merchant could travel from Britain to Syria entirely on Roman roads. Messages could be sent from Rome to any provincial capital and back in weeks rather than months. The roads were marked with milestones showing the distance to the nearest city. Information about who had built or maintained that section, and sometimes the name of the emperor. Rest stations called mansions, spaced about a day's journey apart, provided lodging for travelers and fresh horses for those traveling on official business. The Romans even had a postal service, the cursus publicus, using relay riders who could cover as much as 50 miles a day on official correspondence. Water was life for Roman cities, and the Romans excelled at bringing water where it was needed. They built aqueducts, massive structures that carried water from mountain springs and rivers to cities miles away, using gravity alone to maintain flow. The longest Roman aqueduct, which supplied Carthage after Rome rebuilt it as a Roman city, was 87 miles long. Rome itself was served by 11 major aqueducts bringing in 1,000 cubic meters of water daily, providing each resident with as much water per day as modern New York or Los Angeles residents use. These aqueducts were architectural achievements of stunning beauty and engineering precision. The Pont du Gard in southern France, which carried water to the city of Nîmes, stands today as a three-tiered bridge nearly 160 feet tall, built of huge stone blocks fitted together without mortar. The water channel at the top descended only 1 inch for every 300 feet of length, an incredible feat of surveying and construction that maintained steady flow over 30 miles. Aqueducts ran mostly underground in covered channels, but where they needed to cross valleys, the Romans built magnificent bridges that still inspire awe. The water from these aqueducts supplied public fountains, baths, wealthy homes, and businesses throughout Roman cities. Every Roman city of any size had public baths, which served as social centers as much as places for hygiene. The baths of Caracalla in Rome could accommodate over 1,500 bathers at once, and included hot rooms, warm rooms, cold rooms, swimming pools, exercise areas, libraries, and gardens. The baths were heated by an ingenious system called the hypocaust, where fires in underground furnaces heated air that circulated through spaces beneath the floors and inside the walls, warming the rooms above. Rome's sewage system was equally advanced. The Cloaca Maxima, begun during the monarchy, was one of the world's earliest sewage systems, carrying wastewater from the city into the Tiber River. Public latrines, communal toilets that could seat 20 or more people, were flushed by water from the aqueducts and drained into the sewers. The Romans also had private toilets in wealthier homes, all connected to the sewer system. This attention to sanitation kept Roman cities cleaner and healthier than any cities would be again until the 19th century. Roman engineering reached its peak in buildings like the Colosseum and the Pantheon. The Colosseum, completed in 80 of the Common Era, could hold 50,000 spectators for gladiatorial games and other spectacles. It was a masterpiece of crowd management, with 76 entrances and a complex system of internal corridors that could empty the entire building in minutes. A canvas awning system operated by sailors could be deployed to shade spectators from the sun. Beneath the wooden arena floor was a complex of tunnels and chambers where gladiators, animals, and equipment waited, before being lifted to the surface by elevators powered by slaves turning windlasses. The Pantheon, built under Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century, remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. Its dome, 142 feet in diameter, has stood for nearly 2,000 years, an achievement unmatched until modern times. The oculus at the dome center, an open hole 27 feet across, provides the temple's only light, creating a dramatic shaft of sunlight that moves across the interior as the day progresses. The building's perfect proportions and elegant design made it a model for countless later buildings, including many American state capitol buildings and Thomas Jefferson's Rotunda at the University of Virginia. The secret to much of Roman engineering was concrete. The Romans didn't invent concrete, but they perfected it, developing a formula using volcanic ash called pozzolana that created a cement stronger and more durable than anything available before. Roman concrete could even set underwater, allowing construction of harbor facilities, bridges, and other marine structures. The mixture of volcanic ash, lime, and water created a chemical reaction that made the concrete stronger over time, unlike modern concrete which tends to weaken with age. The Pantheon's dome was cast in concrete over 2,000 years ago and remains structurally sound today. Roman culture and language spread throughout the empire. Latin became the common language of the Western Empire, the language of government, law, commerce, and educated discourse. In the Eastern Empire, Greek continued as the dominant language, for Rome absorbed much of Hellenistic culture and the Greek language had been the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. But even in the East, Latin was the language of the military and administration. Latin literature flourished under the empire. Virgil wrote the Aeneid, an epic poem celebrating Rome's mythical origins and connecting them to the historical Augustus. Horace composed odes and satires that explored themes of morality, politics, and simple pleasures. Ovid's Metamorphoses told Greek and Roman myths in elegant verse, influencing artists and writers for 2 millennia. Livy wrote a massive history of Rome from its founding to his own time, though much of it is now lost. These authors wrote during the reign of Augustus in what is often called the Golden Age of Latin literature. Later imperial authors continued the tradition. Tacitus wrote penetrating histories examining the corruption and tyranny of early emperors while praising the freedom of Rome's earlier days. Juvenal composed bitter satires attacking the vices of Roman society. Seneca wrote philosophical works exploring Stoic ethics and tragedies exploring human passion and suffering. These works were read, copied, and studied throughout the empire and into the Middle Ages, forming the foundation of Western literary tradition. Roman law was perhaps Rome's most lasting contribution to civilization. Roman law evolved from the 12 tables through centuries of legal precedent, philosophical reasoning, and practical application. By the imperial period, Roman law had developed principles that still underpin Western legal systems. The concept of natural law that applies to all people, the presumption of innocence, the right to a legal defense, the idea that the burden of proof lies with the accuser, and the distinction between public law governing state affairs and private law governing relationships between individuals. The Emperor Justinian in the 6th century ordered the compilation of all Roman law into a single comprehensive code, the Corpus Juris Civilis. This preserved Roman legal thought for later ages and became the foundation for the legal systems of most European countries. Even English common law, which developed separately, shows Roman influence. Modern legal terms like habeas corpus, subpoena, pro bono, and many others are Latin phrases taken directly from Roman law. Daily life in the Roman Empire varied greatly depending on wealth, status, and location, but certain commonalities existed that bound this vast civilization together into a recognizable whole. Most people lived in cities or towns rather than isolated rural areas, for the empire was more urbanized than any society would be again until the Industrial Revolution brought mass migration to cities in the 18th and 19th centuries. The wealthy lived in spacious houses called domus, featuring multiple rooms arranged around a central courtyard or atrium open to the sky. These houses had private gardens, sophisticated plumbing systems bringing running water into the home, and elegant decorations including frescoes painted on the walls depicting mythological scenes, landscapes, or trompe-l'oeil architectural features that made rooms appear larger and more grand. Intricate mosaics covered the floors, made from thousands of tiny colored stones arranged into geometric patterns or elaborate scenes. Wealthy Romans filled their homes with statuary, both original Greek works looted from conquered cities and Roman copies of famous masterpieces. They had large staffs of slaves to cook, clean, garden, and manage their household affairs, sometimes owning hundreds of enslaved people who lived in quarters attached to the house or in separate slave barracks. The poor lived in very different circumstances, crowded into multi-story apartment buildings called insulae that could rise 5 or even 6 stories high. These buildings were often shoddily constructed by landlords seeking maximum profit, built with timber frames and brick, highly susceptible to fire and collapse. Ground floor apartments might be relatively spacious and comfortable. But upper floors consisted of cramped, dark rooms reached by narrow staircases, sometimes housing entire families in a single room. These buildings had no running water above the ground floor, no heating except portable braziers that were themselves fire hazards, and no private sanitation facilities. Residents had to carry water up from public fountains and use public latrines or chamber pots that were emptied into pits or the street below. The danger of fire was constant, and when fire broke out in one of these insulae, it could spread rapidly, consuming entire city blocks. The danger of collapse was equally real, with buildings sometimes toppling into the street without warning, crushing anyone unfortunate enough to be passing by. Most people ate a simple diet consisting primarily of bread, olive oil, wine diluted with water, and seasonal vegetables, with meat being a luxury reserved for special occasions or wealthy tables. The staple was bread, which came in various qualities from fine white bread for the rich to coarse dark bread for the poor. Porridge made from wheat or barley was another common staple. Garum, a fermented fish sauce made from fish guts left to ferment in the sun for months, was the universal condiment, used the way we might use ketchup or soy sauce today, adding salt and umami flavor to otherwise bland dishes. The wealthy enjoyed elaborate multi-course banquets lasting for hours, reclining on couches arranged around 3 sides of a table while being entertained by musicians, dancers, acrobats, and poets. Slaves served course after course of exotic delicacies. Peacock tongues, flamingo brains, dormice fattened in clay pots and served stuffed with nuts, elaborate pastries shaped like mythological creatures, wine sweetened with honey and flavored with spices. Between courses, Guests might vomit to make room for more food, using a room called the vomitorium for this purpose, then return to eat more. But even the poor benefited from the grain dole, a distribution of free or subsidized grain to Roman citizens that had begun under the Republic and continued through the Empire, ensuring that even the poorest citizens of Rome itself would not starve. At its height, this dole fed over 300,000 people in the city of Rome alone. Entertainment was absolutely crucial to Roman life and the maintenance of social stability. Chariot races at the Circus Maximus. Rome's enormous racing stadium that could hold over 150,000 spectators, drew passionate crowds who supported different racing factions identified by colors: the blues, the greens, the reds, and the whites. Fans of these factions were as devoted and sometimes as violent as modern soccer hooligans, with riots occasionally breaking out between supporters. Gladiatorial games, though brutal and fatal by modern standards, were wildly popular spectacles that drew crowds from all social classes. These games were not simply mindless violence but elaborately staged productions with different types of gladiators fighting in different styles, trained professionals whose combats followed recognized rules and conventions. Successful gladiators could become wealthy celebrities, adored by fans, though most died young. Wild animal hunts in the arena called venations saw exotic beasts from across the empire: lions, tigers, bears, elephants, rhinos, crocodiles, slaughtered in massive numbers to demonstrate Rome's dominance over nature itself. Theatrical performances ranged from highbrow productions of Greek tragedies to lowbrow mimes and pantomimes featuring bawdy humor and sexual innuendo. Public executions of criminals were turned into theatrical spectacles, with condemned prisoners sometimes forced to reenact mythological deaths or fight as poorly armed gladiators against trained professionals. Mock naval battles called naumachii were staged in flooded arenas or artificial lakes, with thousands of participants fighting in full-scale ship combat, often to the death, for the entertainment of the masses. Emperors understood deeply that keeping the people fed and entertained. What the satirist Juvenal cynically called bread and circuses, was essential to political stability and the prevention of riots and rebellion. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace that Augustus inaugurated, lasted for 2 centuries. During this time, the empire reached its greatest extent under Emperor Trajan, who conquered Dacia and Mesopotamia briefly in the early 2nd century. Trade flourished, with Roman merchants traveling to India and China, bringing back silk, spices, and other luxuries. Art and architecture flourished. Cities across the empire were adorned with forums, temples, theaters, and baths, many of whose ruins can still be visited today. It was a golden age, a time of prosperity and relative peace that seemed as if it might last forever. But nothing lasts forever, and the seeds of Rome's decline were already germinating. The end of the Pax Romana is traditionally dated to 180 of the Common Era, with the death of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, last of the so-called 5 good emperors. His son Commodus, who succeeded him, was cruel, incompetent, and mad, more interested in fighting as a gladiator in the arena than in governing the empire. Commodus's assassination in 192 marked the beginning of a period of crisis that would shake Rome to its foundations. The 3rd century was a time of chaos. Between 235 and 284, Rome had some 50 emperors, most ruling only a few years or even months before being assassinated or defeated in civil war. This period, called the crisis of the 3rd century, saw the empire fragment as generals in different provinces declared themselves emperor and fought each other for control. At one point, the empire split into 3 separate states: the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, and a rump Roman Empire in the center. The crisis was not just political. The economy collapsed under the weight of constant warfare, debased currency, and disruption of trade. Plague swept through the empire, killing millions. Barbarian tribes pushed across the frontiers, raiding and sometimes settling in imperial territory. The Sassanid Persian Empire inflicted crushing defeats on Roman armies in the east. Rome seemed on the verge of total collapse. The empire was saved, temporarily, by a series of strong military emperors who fought to restore central authority. Aurelian reunited the empire, defeating both the Gallic and Palmyrene breakaway states. Diocletian, who became emperor in 284, completely reorganized the imperial government. He divided the empire into eastern and western halves, each ruled by an Augustus with a Caesar as junior emperor and heir, creating what is called the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. He also reformed taxation, the military, and provincial administration, creating a more centralized, bureaucratic state better able to respond to threats. Diocletian's reforms stabilized the empire, but they also made it more rigid and less flexible. The new system required a massive bureaucracy and a larger army, all of which had to be paid for through taxation. The tax burden on the population increased dramatically. To ensure tax revenues, Diocletian tied peasants to the land and workers to their professions, creating a hereditary caste system that would evolve into medieval serfdom. Personal freedom declined as state control increased. The Tetrarchy did not survive Diocletian's retirement. Civil war broke out among the rival emperors and Caesars. From this war emerged Constantine, who defeated his rivals and reunited the empire under his sole rule in 324. Constantine made two momentous decisions that would shape European history for centuries. First, he converted to Christianity and made it a legal religion, ending centuries of sporadic persecution. Christianity would eventually become the empire's official religion, replacing the traditional Roman gods. Second, he founded a new capital on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople after himself. Constantinople, strategically located controlling the strait between Europe and Asia, became the wealthiest and most important city in the empire. It was easier to defend than Rome and closer to the frontiers where threats were greatest. Gradually, the center of imperial power shifted east, to Constantinople, while the Western Empire grew weaker and more peripheral. The late empire saw the rise of powerful barbarian tribes that Rome could no longer simply defeat and absorb. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, Burgundians, and other Germanic peoples had grown more organized and militarily capable. Rome increasingly relied on these barbarian tribes as allies, settling them inside the empire's borders in exchange for military service. Entire barbarian armies were hired as Roman auxiliaries, commanded by their own chieftains. Gradually, the distinction between Roman and barbarian began to blur, especially in the Western Empire. In 376, a massive wave of Gothic refugees appeared on the Danube frontier, fleeing from the Huns, a nomadic people from Central Asia whose sudden appearance in Europe had triggered a chain reaction of tribal migrations. The Romans allowed the Goths to cross into imperial territory and settle in the Balkans, but corrupt Roman officials abused and exploited them. In 378, the Goths rebelled and destroyed a Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople, killing Emperor Valens. This defeat shattered the myth of Roman military invincibility and demonstrated that barbarian armies could defeat Roman legions in open battle. In 406, Germanic tribes crossed the frozen Rhine River in massive numbers and poured into Gaul, then Spain, then North Africa, conquering vast territories. The Western Emperor, ruling from Ravenna, had no power to stop them. Rome itself was sacked by the Visigoth king Alaric in 410, the first time in 800 years that Rome had fallen to an outside enemy. The shock of Rome's fall reverberated throughout the Mediterranean world. Saint Jerome wrote, "The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken." the Western Empire continued to shrink. Britain was abandoned to local rulers and Saxon invaders. Spain fell to the Vandals and Visigoths. North Africa, the empire's breadbasket, was conquered by the Vandals, who established a kingdom centered on Carthage. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Empire consisted of little more than Italy itself, and even there the emperor was a puppet controlled by barbarian generals. In 476, a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustus, whose name ironically echoed Rome's founder and first emperor. Odoacer did not claim the imperial title for himself. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern Emperor Zeno as sole emperor of the Roman Empire, while ruling Italy himself as patrician and king. The Western Roman Empire had ended. Though few at the time recognized the finality of what had happened. The Eastern Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. It preserved Roman law, Greek culture, and Christianity, becoming a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds. But the Western Empire was gone, fragmented into a collection of Germanic kingdoms. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Frankish kingdom in Gaul, the Vandal kingdom in North Africa, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, and smaller kingdoms in Britain and elsewhere. What caused the fall of Rome? Historians have debated this for centuries, proposing explanations ranging from lead poisoning from Roman plumbing to the rise of Christianity sapping Roman martial virtue to economic factors to climate change. The truth is that Rome's fall was overdetermined, caused by multiple factors working together. Economic decline, military challenges, political instability, demographic change, epidemics, climate change, barbarian invasions, and cultural transformation all played roles. The Western Empire fell not because of any single cause, but because the multiple stresses on the system exceeded its capacity to adapt and respond. And so, the greatest empire the Western world had yet seen passed into history. From the mythical twin brothers nursed by a wolf to the last emperor deposed by a barbarian general. Rome's story spanned 1,200 years of triumph and tragedy, conquest and crisis, grandeur and collapse. The empire that had begun as a settlement of shepherds on 7 hills beside the Tiber River, had grown to dominate the Mediterranean world and beyond, leaving a legacy that endures to this day. Roman roads still carry traffic across Europe. Roman aqueducts still supply water to modern cities. Roman law still forms the basis of legal systems around the world. Latin, though no longer spoken as a living language, lives on in the Romance languages of French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, and Romanian, and provides the vocabulary of science, medicine, and law. Roman architecture inspired countless later buildings, from medieval cathedrals to modern government buildings. The very concept of the state, of citizenship, of republic, all come down to us from Rome. The story of Rome is a mirror in which we can see ourselves, our own societies, our own triumphs and failures. It reminds us that nothing lasts forever, that even the mightiest civilizations eventually fall. But it also shows us the endurance of ideas and culture, how the achievements of the past continue to shape the present, how the echoes of ancient voices still speak to us across the centuries. As you drift into peaceful sleep, let these images and stories of ancient Rome settle gently into your mind like dust covering ruins. The legions have marched into silence. The emperors have crumbled to dust. But the eternal city lives on, in memory and in heritage, a testament to human ambition, creativity, and the desire to build something that will last beyond our brief lives. May your dreams carry you to those ancient places, where marble gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, where crowds roared in the Colosseum, where senators debated the fate of nations, where Rome, Caput Mundi, the head of the world, stood in all its glory. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Roman history. If you enjoyed this exploration of the rise and legends of the Roman Empire, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love history. Sweet dreams, and may the wisdom of the ancients guide you through peaceful sleep into a new day.